You know the feeling, when good enough doesn't feel like enough, when rest feels like giving up, when every detail matters too much because somewhere deep inside, you believe that perfection is the only thing standing between you and being forgotten. You stay up late, fixing things no one else will notice. You can't delegate because no one else sees what you see. You feel physically ill at the thought of making a mistake. And when people praise your work, you feel nothing. Or worse, you feel like a fraud, waiting for them to discover you're not actually special at all. There's a particular exhaustion that comes with this. Not just tiredness, something deeper. The wariness of a person who's been auditioning for love their entire life, believing that being chosen depends on being extraordinary. This is a story about what that belief costs. It's told through Steve Jobs, but it's not really about him. It's about the part of you that understands what it means to build monuments while feeling broken inside. The part that mistakes perfection for wholeness. The part that's terrified of being ordinary. Steve Jobs stood on stages and unveiled objects of impossible beauty. Devices so precisely designed, so obsessively refined, that they felt like artifacts from a more evolved civilization. The curves, the weight, the way light moved across glass. Nothing accidental. Nothing left to chance. People called him a genius, a visionary, the man who put 1,000 songs in your pocket and the internet in your hand. But perfectionism this extreme is never really about the product. It's about something much older, much quieter, much more desperate. Jobs was adopted at birth. His biological mother, a young graduate student, gave him up because her family couldn't accept his Syrian biological father. Even though his adoptive parents loved him, even though they chose him, something inside a preverbal infant couldn't understand why the first person who was supposed to keep him didn't. Psychologist Nancy Verrier calls this the primal wound, a rupture in attachment that happens before language, before memory, before conscious thought. The infant brain doesn't know about family disapproval or cultural prejudice. It only knows that survival was threatened, that someone left. That somehow, on a level too deep for words, you weren't enough to be kept. And that belief doesn't go away just because you're later loved. It becomes a ghost frequency beneath everything, a quiet terror that you could be abandoned again at any moment. So you become hyper-competent, hyper-controlling, hyper-critical. You create things so beautiful, so undeniable that no one could possibly reject you. But here's what you learn eventually. The wound never heals through achievement. You only become more isolated inside your excellence. Maybe you recognize this in yourself, not because you were adopted, but because somewhere along the way, you learned that your worth was conditional, that love had to be earned, that being chosen depended on being extraordinary. Maybe it was a parent who only noticed you when you succeeded. Maybe it was a childhood that felt fundamentally unsafe, where you developed the magical thinking that if you were just perfect enough, nothing bad would happen. Maybe it was a world that taught you early that being ordinary meant being invisible. Whatever the origin, you know what it feels like to live with a low-grade panic humming beneath everything. To wake up and feel the silence of the morning as dangerous, too much space for thoughts you don't want to think. So you work, and the work feels electric at first, alive with purpose. You're building something that will prove, once and for all, that you matter. But nothing is ever quite right. The angle is wrong, the color is off, the person you hired isn't good enough, your team doesn't see what you see, and their failure to understand feels like betrayal, like abandonment, like proof that you're alone in this. You're cruel sometimes. You hear yourself saying things that hurt people. Part of you watches from a distance, horrified. But you can't stop, because their mediocrity threatens everything. If they fail, you fail. And if you fail, you disappear. This is what psychologist Thomas Greenspan means when he writes that perfectionism isn't about achievement. It's about fear of being unworthy. The perfectionist doesn't pursue excellence for joy. They pursue it to avoid annihilation of the self. Your nervous system is always on high alert. Everything matters too much. Every detail is life or death. You can't delegate, can't trust, can't let go. Because letting go feels like losing control of your right to exist. You're exhausted. But stopping feels more dangerous than burnout. Jobs was famous for what colleagues called his reality distortion field. He could convince anyone of anything, make the impossible seem inevitable, inspire teams to achieve what they believed they couldn't. But beneath charisma, this intense, often lives something fragile. Developmental trauma experts explain that narcissistic patterns, the swing between grandiosity and worthlessness, emerge when a child's emotional needs are chronically unmet. The child learns, my real self is unlovable. I must construct a superior self to survive. This isn't vanity, it's terror. The narcissistic shell is a fortress built around a deeply wounded child who believes they're fundamentally defective. You might know this pattern if you swing between feeling destined for greatness and feeling like an imposter. If criticism feels like a death sentence, if you need to be the smartest person in the room to feel safe, if you've ever torn someone down because their competence threatened your fragile sense of worth. You live in a constant state of performance. You can never truly relax into yourself because yourself doesn't feel like enough. You need the world to confirm your specialness because inside, you're terrified, you're nobody. Every challenge to your authority feels like evidence of your deepest fear, that you're the fraud you've always suspected you were. Jobs was notorious for his treatment of employees. Products were either insanely great or total shit. People were geniuses or idiots, in or out, perfect or worthless. No nuance, no middle ground. Psychologists call this splitting, a primitive defense where everything is categorized as completely good or completely bad. It's how young children naturally think before they develop the capacity to hold complexity. But when trauma disrupts development, this black and white thinking persists. You know this pattern if you've ever loved someone intensely and then suddenly seen them as the enemy. If you've quit something the moment it stopped being perfect. If you're either all in or completely checked out, never in between. The world feels unstable, so you create false stability through extremes. But this makes intimacy impossible. People can't meet your standards because your standards aren't actually about them. They're about your need to control reality. You cycle through relationships, projects, identities, always searching for the perfect thing that will finally make you feel whole. But wholeness doesn't come from perfection. It comes from integration, from learning to hold the good and the bad together, from accepting that people, including you, can be both brilliant and flawed. Jobs initially denied paternity of his daughter Lisa, even named a computer after her while refusing to acknowledge the connection. He had tumultuous relationships. He was described by many as emotionally cold, despite moments of intense connection. This is what attachment researchers call avoidant attachment. When children don't receive consistent emotional attunement, they learn to deactivate their attachment system. They suppress emotional needs and learn to rely only on themselves. The abandonment wound creates a terrible bind. I desperately need connection, but connection feels life-threateningly dangerous because everyone who gets close might leave. You might recognize this if you push people away the moment they get too close. If you're more comfortable with projects than people. If you've ever sabotaged a relationship because intimacy felt like suffocation. If you long for connection but find yourself criticizing everyone who offers it. You're lonely but terrified of depending on anyone. Vulnerability feels like handing someone the weapon they'll eventually use against you. So you stay in control. You prioritize work over relationships. You keep people at arm's length while secretly aching to be truly known. But being known means being seen as imperfect, and that feels unbearable. At night, you lie awake replaying every imperfection. The detail you missed, the moment you lost control, the person who disagreed with you. You try to strategize how to fix it, but beneath the planning is something else, a cold, hollow feeling, like falling through space, like being erased. People admire you, they call you talented, they write about your achievements, and you feel nothing. Or worse, you feel fraudulent, because if they knew who you really were, underneath the performance, they wouldn't stay. So you work harder, you control more, you perfect more. But the cycle never ends. Because the thing you're really trying to fix isn't the product. It's the feeling that you were given away once, and if you're not extraordinary, you'll be given away again. Existential psychologist Ernest Becker wrote that much of human behavior is motivated by terror of non-existence. we create what he called immortality projects: art, companies, ideas, legacies, to transcend our finite lives, to leave something that outlasts death. For someone carrying Job's wound, this drive intensifies. If you weren't enough to be kept as an infant, perhaps you can become undeniable through your creations. Perhaps your products can be the love object that never dies, never rejects, never leaves. Jobs explicitly framed Apple products as extensions of himself. Making a dent in the universe wasn't metaphor, it was survival. You know this if your work is the only thing that makes you feel like you matter. If you panic at the thought of being forgotten. If you've sacrificed relationships, health, presence for a legacy. If you believe that when you die, your value dies too. Unless you've created something permanent. You're running from death through constant productivity. Rest feels like rehearsal for the grave. You can't enjoy the present because you're building monuments to the future. Every moment not working feels like wasted time, wasted life. You're exhausted. But stopping would mean confronting the truth you've been fleeing. That you're mortal, limited, and human. When Jobs was diagnosed with a rare, treatable form of pancreatic cancer in 2003, he initially refused surgery. He tried to cure it through diet and alternative medicine. This wasn't ignorance, it was psychological. Accepting conventional treatment meant surrendering control. Admitting vulnerability, acknowledging he couldn't will his way through everything. Trauma researcher Bessel van der Kolk established that trauma is stored in the body. When emotions are chronically suppressed, especially in perfectionistic, avoidant personalities, the nervous system remains in perpetual stress activation. This dysregulation contributes to inflammation, immune suppression, disease. You might recognize this if your body crashes when you finally slow down. If you get sick after major achievements. If you've ignored pain until it became undeniable. If you've believed that acknowledging physical limits meant weakness. Your body is screaming what your mind won't say. Slow down. Feel your feelings. You're not a machine, but you've built your entire identity on transcending human limitation. So you push through pain, override signals, treat your body as an obstacle to productivity, until one day it stops cooperating, and even then you try to control it. There's an archetype that appears across cultures and throughout history: the wounded king. He possesses vision, power, the ability to bring order to chaos. His kingdom prospers, but he carries a wound that never heals. The wounded king's flaw is that he cannot accept his own vulnerability. He rules through strength, but the wound festers because he won't acknowledge it. His authority is absolute, but his pain is invisible. His isolation deepens even as his influence grows. Jobs embodied this archetype completely. He changed industries, inspired millions, created objects of genuine beauty, but he also suffered profoundly. He hurt people. He couldn't rest. He couldn't let himself be ordinarily, messily, imperfectly human. The question perfectionism never answers is this: am I enough, just as I am? Not because of what I've built, not because of what I've proven. Not because I've transcended my limitations or controlled every variable or created something undeniable. Just because I exist. And if you've lived inside perfectionism's fortress, you know how terrifying that question feels. Because you've never believed the answer could be yes. In his final years, as his body failed despite his will, something softened in Jobs. He reconciled with his daughter. He admitted vulnerability. He accepted help. Those who knew him described a man finally confronting his humanity. Not because he wanted to, because he had no choice. When you can no longer perform, produce, or control, when your body forces you to stop, you face the existential crisis you've been running from. If I can't create, who am I? If I can't achieve, do I matter? This is the perfectionist's final dilemma, the question that was always waiting underneath the work. This isn't about judgment. Jobs created extraordinary things, and he suffered extraordinarily. Both can be true. The question isn't whether perfectionism is wrong. It's whether it's working, whether the cost is sustainable, whether you're building monuments or running from something. What would happen if you stopped? Not forever, just for a moment. Long enough to feel what you've been fleeing. Maybe you'd discover that the child who was left behind or made to feel unworthy or taught that love was conditional has been waiting all this time for you to come back. Not with achievements, not with proof of your specialness, just with presence, with acknowledgement. with the willingness to finally see them. What if your worth wasn't conditional? What if you didn't have to outrun your wound? What if being ordinary, being human, being flawed, being limited was already enough? Not because someone told you it was, but because you decided to believe it, to test it, to build a life not to prove your value, but because you already have it. Maybe excellence isn't about perfection. Maybe it's about finally coming home to yourself, to the parts you've been trying to transcend, to the vulnerability you've been trying to control away, to the simple, radical truth that you deserve to exist without having to earn it. Jobs spent his life believing that if he created something perfect enough, he could finally be enough. But perfection is a prison disguised as a pursuit, and the door was never locked. It opens from the inside. You just have to be willing to stop performing long enough to walk through it.